So in this video, we are going to talk about the endocrine system, specifically the histology, all the slides involved on the endocrine system for our Anatomy and Physiology II Lab. So with the endocrine system, we have lots of slides of different organs. Our first one up is going to be the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is going to sit below the brain, below the hypothalamus. It's going to be this little guy, kind of looks like a jelly belly, or jelly bean sized little guy that sits down there underneath the hypothalamus. And so on the pituitary gland, it's going to have two areas. So we got the whole thing in this picture right here, but maybe I hope we can make out that there is a lighter section up here, and then there is this darker section behind. So the darker section on our slides are going to be the adenohypophysis. It's the scientific word for the anterior pituitary gland. And so the adenohypophysis is going to let out 7 different hormones from the front pituitary part of the gland. The 7 different hormones are follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone that have to do with your gonads, the adrenocorticotropic hormone that has to do with the adrenal gland, thyroid-stimulating hormone, thyroid, growth hormone, bones, muscles, all that good stuff, prolactin, lactation, and melanocyte-stimulating hormone, MSH, are 7 different hormones that are coming from this guy. So this darker section of the slide. So when in doubt, if you see a slide that has like a darker section and a lighter section next to it, you are looking at the pituitary gland. And this part is the adenohypophysis. All this dark stuff is the anterior pituitary, the adenohypophysis. Now, those are the 7 hormones that come from that part of the pituitary. But what about the posterior pituitary? So the posterior pituitary is going to be this section over here. This is the neurohypophysis. It is the posterior part of the pituitary. And on the slides, in general, it's usually a lighter color. Like sometimes it's a lighter pink when compared to the adenohypophysis, which is usually kind of like a purple color. So our neurohypophysis is named a neurohypophysis because up in the hypothalamus, we are going to synthesize, we're going to create 2 hormones. We're going to create oxytocin and we're going to create ADH. And those hormones are going to be synthesized up in the hypothalamus. And then they're going to come down the little neuron axons down the infundibulum and into this little jelly belly little organ, the pituitary gland, and it's going to come out the backside of it. So that's why it's called the neurohypophysis, because the little endings of those neurons are going to release in the posterior pituitary. So the neurohypophysis is going to release ADH and oxytocin. The anterior pituitary, here's our post-pit, neurohypophysis, posterior pituitary, adenohypophysis, anterior pituitary, post-pit, ADH, oxytocin, anterior pituitary, FSH, LH, acetylcorticotropic, ACTH, thyroid-stimulating TSH, growth hormone, GH, prolactin, PRL, and melanocyte-stimulating hormone, MSH. All of those are coming from the anterior pituitary. So know how to recognize your slide. What are you looking at? What organ are you looking at? We're looking at the pituitary gland. And once you figure out that we're looking at the pituitary gland, are we looking at the anterior part? Are we looking at the posterior part? Are we looking at the adenohypophysis? Or are we looking at the neurohypophysis? And then once we know which section we're looking in, anterior, posterior, adeno, or neurohypophysis, then we know what hormones come from those. So we're going to memorize the 7 that come from the adenohypophysis, and we're going to memorize the 2 that come from the posterior pituitary or the neurohypophysis. Next up is going to be the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland is going to be this organ right here. That little thyroid gland is right here. And then behind the thyroid gland are going to be these little kind of button looking things that are the parathyroid. So they're on like the posterior side of the thyroid gland. So we can see both of those in the slide when you are zoomed out on the scanning power. Here's the whole thing. So this section right here in purple, this is the parathyroid. And then if you can make out all these little follicles over here, all of this is thyroid. So parathyroid, thyroid over here. On the thyroid, we've zoomed in. So this would be our like delineation where we have parathyroid over here. And then we have thyroid over here. On the thyroid, if we zoom in on the thyroid, we can definitely see the follicles. So let's zoom in a little bit. On the follicles, each one of these is a follicle. So here's one right here. And these guys are going to have cells that line them. So these are the follicle cells. All these guys in purple right here are the follicle cells. So every single one of those little guys. And then the follicle cells are going to secrete a substance. They are going to produce this thyroglobulin. Thyroglobulin is going to meet up with iodine that we get in our diet. And together they will combine and they will create two substances that we use for metabolism, T3 and T4. So T3 and T4 are coming out of the thyroglobulin and iodine that's in this jelly-like colloid here in the middle. So you can tell that it's kind of jelly-like because if you look at the edges, they look like this jello is kind of like pulled away from the side on this follicle. So we need to know for the thyroid gland, two things. Metabolism that we've talked about so far. Metabolism is going to be produced by the follicle cells, these guys. Metabolism is going to be produced by the follicle cells. The follicle cells are going to produce thyroglobulin that meets up with iodine, combines, and together we can use that to create T3 and T4. And that is all in this jelly-like colloid. This stuff, this stuff, this stuff. This is all the jelly-like colloid, the thyroglobulin and iodine is all of this. So that's the first job of the thyroid gland. When you think thyroid, I want you to think of metabolism, but I also want you to think of job number 2, calcium levels, regulating calcium levels. So there are cells, parafollicular cells, also called clear cells or C cells. So maybe this guy right there is kind of like darker looking one. We would say that guy could be a parafollicular cell. So on our parafollicular cells, they are in charge of calcium. So your blood calcium levels, we want it to be at homeostasis. And sometimes your blood calcium levels get too high. And that's where your parafollicular cells, the C cells, the clear cells are going to release a hormone called calcitonin. Calcitonin is going to take that high calcium level and drop it down to your normal homeostatic range for calcium. So these guys, I'm just going to put a C here for the clear cell, C cell, parafollicular cell. For those guys, this arrow is going to follicle cells for our thyroid hormones. So two things coming out of the thyroid gland. T3 and T4 produced by thyroglobulin and iodine. That's coming from the follicle cells. And then parafollicular cells, also called clear cells and C cells, those guys are going to produce calcitonin. So those are the two things I want you to think about when we think about thyroid. Parathyroid is also related to calcium. So here again was that whole thyroid and parathyroid together on the slide. Now we're just going to look at the parathyroid part right here. And this was the parathyroid part. So if we zoom in on that, we get this over here. So when we zoom in on the parathyroid, we can see that there are lots of dark purpley colored cells. All these purple cells here are parathyroid cells, or chief cells is another name for these guys. There's a little occipital cell, so we'll put him out of the way. But the chief cells, the parathyroid cells, are the purple ones on the slide, and they are going to produce parathyroid hormone, also called PTH. And that is going to take our low blood calcium and raise it back up to where we want it to be at homeostatic levels. So parathyroid gland, that is on the back side, posterior side of your thyroid gland. There's a couple of little ones back there. Your parathyroid gland is this guy on a slide. Look for the purple cells, and those guys are going to be your parathyroid cells. They're going to produce parathyroid hormone. Now we're going to scooch on down, and we're going to go down to the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland, when you zoom out, you can see the whole thing, and it kind of, to me, looks like somebody had some lipstick on and, like blotted, put a kissy face on something. I think it kind of looks like that personally, but you may think it looks like something else. But to me, I think it looks like a kissy face. So we've got our adrenal gland all along here. And if you notice that some areas are darker, all of this is darker, and then other areas are lighter. So the darker part is on the inside, and that's always going to be your medulla, or medulla, however you want to pronounce it. And the lighter stuff is going to be the cortex. Adrenal gland has medulla and a cortex, just like the kidneys, just like lymph nodes and other things that we've talked about in anatomy and physiology. So the medulla is on the inside. It's the darker part, and it is going to produce two hormones that we need to know. It's our adrenaline hormones. It's going to be epi and norepinephrine. Epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epi and norepi produced in the adrenal medulla. So these are going to be your fight or flight. When your adrenaline dumps, that's what's going out. So it's coming from the medulla, inside part of your adrenal gland. The cortex, this lighter part, The lighter part is divided into three zones, and each zone is going to produce a category of hormone. So our first zone is going to be the zona glomerulosa. So it's kind of this area here, not the lighter stuff, but the stuff in between. This stuff will be the zona glomerulosa. And the zona glomerulosa is going to produce a substance called mineral corticoids. That's the category, mineral corticoids. One of our favorite mineral corticoids that we have talked about so far in AP2 is aldosterone. Aldosterone is associated with bringing in sodium into the bloodstream. We talk about reabsorption of sodium in the kidneys. Aldosterone is where it's at. So aldosterone is a mineral corticoid, and you can find it inside the zona glomerulosa. That's where that's going to be produced in that area. The next zone is this, I hope we can kind of make it out, this kind of lighter zone on the cortex, the lighter zone. You may be hearing my dog snoring too in the background. I'm sorry, she's loud. She's a snorer. So the lighter zone in the cortex, it's the middle one in the sandwich. So our middle one is zona fasciculata. That's this one. Again, this lighter zone is fasciculata in the cortex. The fasciculata is going to be in charge of glucocorticoids. So your glucocorticoids are stress hormones. So if you are stressed, you're going to need energy to do stuff. So you've got cortisol, and so that's a glucose-sparing one. It's going to help you raise your blood sugar if you are stressed out and you need energy for whatever the thing is that's causing you to be stressed. Cortisol will do that for you. It has glucose-sparing properties, and it is a glucocorticoid coming out of zona fasciculata, this lighter area here. We're going to say ZF for the cortex. And then our last but not least part of the adrenal cortex, the middle part as you approach the medulla, is going to be our gonatocorticoids that we find in the zona reticularis. So we'll say this one is ZR, zona reticularis. And with the zona reticularis, it's going to release gonatocorticoids. So think of gonads, think sex hormones, your androgens, testosterone, estrogen, those kind of guys. Those are gonatocorticoids, and they come from this zone right here. It's going to be your zona reticularis, and the category that it produces is gonatocorticoids. So all of these cortex, adrenal cortex hormones have corticoid in the name. Where in the cortex are they located? Mineral corticoids are going to be on the outside. Glucocorticoids are on the middle. Gonatocorticoids are going to be the last stop before you hit the medulla area that's really dark. So be able to recognize the adrenal gland on a slide. I think it looks like a kissy face. And then know if you're looking at the medulla. Are you looking at the medulla in the middle in the dark part? Or are you looking at the light part at the cortex? And if you're looking at the cortex, you might have to give an example of a mineral corticoid, a glucocorticoid, a gonatocorticoid, and know those examples too. All right, our next one is going to be the pancreas. And for the pancreas, if we zoom out, so I've got it here on like scanning power, we can see that there are light pink areas, and then there are dark purple areas. Light pink areas are the islets of Langerhans. The dark purple areas are all acini or acinar cells. So if we zoom in on these guys, we can zoom in on the light pink area. So the light pink area is what we're focusing on as far as endocrine properties. Pancreas is super cool because it's both. It's endocrine and exocrine. Exocrine is going to be all of those dietary secretions that we talked about, the proteases, the lipase, the amylase for all the different macros. Pancreas secretes those as far as exocrine properties. For endocrine properties, islet of Langerhans is where it's at. So these little light pink areas on here, not this stuff, not the acini and the purple stuff. We want to talk about the light pink stuff. So the light pink stuff is islet of Langerhans. And in this slide, I've gotten even bigger and zoomed in even further. I think I'm on high power right here. But this is a really good close-up of the islet of Langerhans. And so within the islet of Langerhans, there's different cells in there, and they're going to produce different things. So we need to know that in the islet of Langerhans, for our lab, we need to know that we have insulin being produced in here and glucagon being produced in here. Both of these help regulate blood sugar. Insulin's going to drop high blood sugar, bring it down. Glucagon is going to take low blood sugar and bring it up. Both of those guys, blood sugar, insulin, glucagon. We also have two other hormones that are coming from the islet of Langerhans. Somatostatin and pancreatic polypeptide, are also called just PP, are coming out of the islet of Langerhans too. So there's 4 things that can come from the islet of Langerhans. Be able to recognize the pancreas, know what you're looking at. If you see something like this is the pancreas, and then know that the pancreas is both endocrine and exocrine. And specifically for this chapter, this exercise, we are looking at its exocrine properties. So we want to know all about this light pink section called the islet of Langerhans. And if we zoom in on the islet of Langerhans, you can see all the different cells in here. And these different cells are going to produce, again, 4 things: insulin, glucagon, somatostatin, and pancreatic polypeptide, or PP, coming from the islet of Langerhans. The next 2 are our last 2. There are gonads, our reproductive organs. So with the gonads, we have the testes. So I've got a little model just to show you the testes, where they're at, and how inside the testes, there's lots of these little tubes, and the tubes are where the sperm is formed. So we have seminiferous tubules on our histology slide. Lots of them. You can see on scanning power, all of these different tubules. And if I bump up the magnification and we go to low power, it looks like this. So we've got one tubule right here. Here's one of the seminiferous tubules. And the cells that are going to line these guys are going to be our spermatogenesis cells, or little sperm-making cells. And they are going to produce the sperm, and possibly, maybe faintly, we can see on the inside of that, on the lumen, on the empty space, that it looks like there's some little light pink stuff in there. So there may be baby sperm in there. The baby sperm are called spermatids. So that would be these guys in here, in the lumen would be the spermatids. But all of this stuff out here, all of these cells, all of this, these guys are going to be the spermatogonia, the stem cells that make the sperm baby cells. And so these guys are going to undergo meiosis. Well, they go mitosis first, and then they'll do meiosis. And at the end result, we are going to have 4 little baby sperm, and those guys are going to be these little spermatids here in the lumen. So those are in the tubules. The tubules are in charge of making the sperm, little baby sperm, spermatids. On the outsides, in between, so we've got all these tubules set up, but there's spaces, gaps in between the tubules. You can see it in the little model here too. There's gaps in between the tubules, and in those gaps, we are going to have our interstitial cells. There's a little group of one right there. Here's a set of one. And they are going to be our Leydig cells, Sertoli cells. These guys are going to be in charge of producing testosterone coming from our Leydig cells, and Sertoli cells will produce inhibin. So if testosterone is low, the Leydig cells are going to kick in and bring testosterone levels up. If testosterone levels get too high, the Sertoli cells will produce inhibin and bring them back down. So those are from this area here. So if you're looking at a slide and you see the tubules like this guy, they are going to produce the sperm. So they are covered in spermatogonia, and then inside in the middle are going to be the little baby spermatids that eventually make their way out of the tubules, out of the testes, and into the epididymis, and they'll grow up and mature there for a little while. If you find things outside of the tubules, those are going to be our interstitial cells, our Sertoli and Leydig cells, all of these guys outside of the tubules, in between, in the spaces in between. That's what those guys are for. And they are going to produce the male hormones, testosterone. And if testosterone is really high, inhibin comes along and shuts it down. Moving on down is the ovaries. So that's our last stop, our ovaries. So female reproductive organ. Testes are going to produce the sperm. Ovaries are going to produce the eggs. You're actually born with all the eggs you're ever going to have in your ovaries, but then those eggs are going to mature as you get older. When you hit puberty, those eggs will start to develop. So we've got all different types of eggs in here, different types of follicles in here. You're going to have your primary eggs, and that's this stuff all up here. It kind of looks like, on the edge of the ovary, I think it looks like bubbles. But you may think it looks like something else. I kind of think it looks like little bubbles, and all the little bubbles are baby eggs. So the baby eggs are primary oocytes, and they are wrapped around little squamous cells that go around them, and that's their little follicle. And their follicles are called primordial follicles because they're the babiest of babies. They haven't grown up at all. So we've got those primordial follicles up here on the edge of the ovary. And then we are going to have primaries. Let's see if we can find a primary. Where's a primary for us? This one. It kind of looks like a primary, maybe, sort of. Maybe advanced primary. Let's see if we can find another one. Ooh, that's a good one. Here's one. Maybe an example of a good primary. So that oocyte is going to develop, and it's going to go from a primordial follicle into a primary follicle. And as these things develop, we're going to see that the cells go from like one simple round of simple squamous, and then they're going to get cuboidal, and then they're going to go from simple cuboidal to stratified cuboidal. And those cells on the outside are going to be thecal cells and granulosal cells. So if you check out this layer of cells right here, this layer of cells right here, there's a big old thick layer of cells around this stuff. Those guys, thecal and granulosal cells, and those guys are going to produce our androgens. So thecal cells, progesterone, granulosal cells will be estrogen, and together those are going to be our female reproductive hormones coming from the ovaries. So your estrogen is going to be coming off of those granulosal cells. If estrogen gets really high, inhibin, just like we talked about with testosterone, will come along and shut it down. But these guys are thecal cells and granulosal cells that are going around the outside, the follicle of this thing, are where we're going to have our hormone production there. The little guys in the center are the eggs themselves. Our primary oocytes are our primordial follicles in here. And then our primary oocytes, when we hit puberty, those follicles will develop. So once you hit puberty, your eggs are going to start to develop. Once a month, you're going to develop one, maybe a couple eggs at a time, and they will go from primordial to primary to secondary and eventually to Graafian, also called a tertiary follicle. So let's see if we can find it. Here's a really good one. This one right here, right smack in the middle. This guy's an excellent example of a tertiary follicle. So do we need to know all the development stages of the follicle at this point for endocrine? No, you don't need to know all the different follicles at the stage of endocrine, but do know that the follicles are going to be this package that sits around the egg. And that package is made of thecal cells and granulosal cells. And those guys are going to produce progesterone, our pregnancy hormone, and estrogen, our other female hormone, that are combined going to be both of our female reproductive hormones. And that's what we're focused on as far as endocrine chapter here. So all of these guys will be producing our estrogen and progesterone on the outside. This guy is going to be a secondary oocyte, and this is a Graafian follicle. Graafian follicles can also be called Graafian or tertiary. Handwriting is not so great getting it in those tiny little boxes, but that is the different type of follicles. What we need to know for endocrine, though, is that ovaries are going to produce eggs. They are surrounded by follicles, and the cells around those guys are going to produce estrogen and progesterone. So that is the ovary and all the different follicles. And I hope that you found that this was helpful as far as histology. Can you identify the organ? What organ are you looking for? Once you know what organ you're looking for, are there any specific characteristics or traits that you need to know about that organ? And more specifically, as far as endocrine, what hormone does that organ produce? Can you tell me what comes from that organ that you are looking at? What is this slide covering? What does it produce? Those are our big takeaways from histology for endocrine. So I hope this helped. And if you have any questions, just let me know. Thanks.